This time in Eye on Yellow Fever, we're taking you inside the Amazon rainforest. From population growth, deforestation, and extractive industries like mining, to the wider impacts of climate change, we are exploring the various ways human activity is increasing the risk of mosquito-borne diseases like yellow fever.
Climate change and also land use change are the major drivers for novel ecological conditions that are adequate for virus dispersion.
These human activities generate species, mosquitoes, as well as rodents or bats, for example, and these are the very types of species that seem to also be very good hosts and vectors for disease.
A complex and interconnected weave of human-induced factors is having a huge impact on both yellow fever risk and wider public and environmental health.
The environmental changes can amplify the interface between human-dominated environment and natural environment, increasing the likelihood of human contact with a zoonotic arbovirus, and their reservoirs, and this enhances the likelihood of interspecies spillover.
What is happening in this fragile and vitally important ecosystem of the Amazon basin? What is the impact on yellow fever? And what can be done to improve things? All that is coming up.
The risk of outbreaks of the deadly disease yellow fever is both significant and growing. This is down to a cocktail of contributing factors, including climate change and increasing pressure on land, greater movement of people, particularly into cities, and a resurgence in our highly connected world of the mosquito species that carries and transmits the disease. Yellow fever may not be the most obvious global public health threat, but it's a disease with no cure and a growing risk that must be taken seriously. We are Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemics, that's I for short. From the world's most senior public health experts to those on the front line of combating this deadly disease wherever it emerges, we have the inside story on yellow fever's expanding global risk. This is Eye on Yellow Fever.
My name's Maggie Silver, and I'm from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, one of the Eye Strategy's partners. This time on Eye on Yellow Fever, I'm joined by not one, but two experts. They've spent years in the field studying climate change and human-made impacts on disease transmission.
My name is Amy Vitor, and I'm an assistant professor at the University of Florida, the College of Medicine, where I'm an infectious disease physician and scientist. I've been focusing mostly on mosquito-borne pathogens, and especially the factors that drive their emergence, such as deforestation.
I'm Anice Salom. I'm a professor of epidemiology, public health ecology, and mosquito ecology in the School of Public Health in the University of São Paulo in Brazil.
Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. First up, how do climate and human-made environmental changes affect arboviruses and how they spread?
When we talk about viruses that are hosted by mosquitoes, oftentimes we're also including those that are hosted not just by mosquitoes, but also by non-human animals. So climate impacts the mosquito then by affecting the range in which it can exist, the speed at which the virus can be transmitted within it, but it also impacts the range of the animal host and its abundance. So all these things, temperature, humidity, as well as vegetation type, urbanization, are very influential on this virus, mosquito, and animal triad that comprises the transmission cycle.
And Dr. Saloom, your research has focused on, the impacts of climate change on virus transmission in South America. Building off of that last question, could you tell us more about your work in the region and the environmental impacts of humans, specifically on arboviruses?
There are at least 10,000 viruses that can infect humans. Most of them circulate in zoonotic cycles that include sylvatic mammals as reservoirs.
If these terms aren't immediately familiar, zoonotic refers to a disease that has jumped from animals to humans. The phrase sylvatic cycle refers to the passing of a pathogen between wild animals and a transmission vector. In the case of yellow fever and many arboviruses, the vector is mosquitoes. Any environmental change that increases the extent to which humans are exposed to sylvatic cycle pathogens increases the likelihood of humans contracting the disease. These changes include a range of human encroachment into previously pristine areas of the forest, including deforestation, mining, and clearing land for farming.
So, all these changes break some barriers that used to exist among species, and they put all the species together. And then it's possible to have interspecies transmission of some arbovirus.
And so, specifically looking at the Amazon rainforest, what changes have taken place over the last 20 years that could be affecting the spread of arboviruses?
Essentially, you have had a huge migration of people into remote areas that were previously forested that then become deforested, basically due to agriculture, but also logging, mining, these kinds of activities. So essentially, you bring a lot of human beings into an area where they weren't before. And as you do that, you enhance the contact that Dr. Salim was just talking about between humans and wildlife. So naturally, that then leads to spillover events that we've been seeing all over the place. Some notable viruses, for example, that we note in Panama alone include the novel emergence of Madariaga virus. There's been Mayaro virus outbreaks. Una virus is a new one. There really are quite a few new viruses that perhaps are even still waiting to be named. So this kind of contact has definitely been increasing over the years. Then you also have large-scale industrial agriculture that has contributed to soy farming, for example, cattle ranching, especially in the Amazon basin. That has a whole nother type of dynamic that's associated with. The net effect does seem to be that these human activities generate species, mosquitoes, as well as rodents or bats, for example, that tend to really be opportunists. They can take advantage of these new conditions, and these are the very types of species that seem to also be very good hosts and vectors for disease.
The economic integration of the Amazons is based on the use and exploitation of renewable and non-renewable natural resources. This has caused extensive environmental change with consequences for people's health and well-being, and hampered the economic development of traditional communities.
Professor Saloom says extractive industries, logging, mining, prospecting, are increasingly placing people into pristine rainforest areas. This puts the people involved into more extensive contact, not just with wildlife, but also with indigenous people, who themselves are vulnerable.
People are going into the area to exploit resources. This is facilitate the spread of infectious disease, especially in indigenous population in the Amazons. They live in the remote areas, and nowadays the pristine forests are in those indigenous areas. People want to exploit those natural resources, and also mining, gold mining. Just from 2019 to 2020, the deforestation in the Amazons increased 64% just in 1 year. In pristine areas, we can see an escalation of exploitation of gold, wood, and all kinds of minerals that has value for the international trade. This has increased deforestation, is causing social conflict, and also vector-borne disease, and especially falciparum malaria that is increasing quite a lot. For example, roads, construction of roads, reservoirs, water reservoirs for generate electricity. All these areas are facilitating the movement of people into new areas. But the most important front for devastation is along the agricultural frontiers that goes from southeast to northwest. This is the expansion, agriculture and cattle frontiers.
We've talked about deforestation, but weather is also a factor here. The Amazon has experienced intense droughts, heavy flooding over the past few years. How does extreme weather events affect arbovirus' ability to spread, whether it's yellow fever or other arboviruses that are circulating?
I think that there are a couple different mechanisms that could transpire with extreme weather. So, for example, if you have drought, we've seen with West Nile, actually you get amplification of transmission because why? Because you have these species that are now coming to the same watering hole, for example, and coming into closer contact with one another. On the other hand, flooding with extreme wetness may also lead to increased transmission because now you have an increase of available breeding sites from particular mosquitoes. So this is very scenario specific, but that Madariaga virus in Panama, for example, that major outbreak that first was described in 2010 occurred on the heels of a lot of flooding in the region. So I think it can go both ways. The other aspect of this is when you talk about maybe urbanization and urban cycles of yellow fever and other arboviral diseases, there you have water storage behaviors that come into play. So when people don't have reliance on good water supply, they are more likely to store their water in large containers right adjacent to their homes. In that kind of circumstance, you might have a lot of Aedes aegypti breeding.
Just a reminder that Aedes aegypti is the mosquito species associated with rapid spread of yellow fever and some other common arboviral diseases like dengue, chikungunya, and Zika, especially in urban areas.
I will add one more thing. With increased flooding and rainfall, you also get increased humidity, and humidity is really important for survival of mosquitoes. So the longer they survive, they're able to transmit any pathogen. Usually the degree of transmission is highly dependent on how long they survive. So you get an incremental increase in transmission with each day longer that they do survive. Again, I really would like to stress the role of humidity there.
Higher temperature can fasten the mosquito development, and also they affect the mosquito survival and also the blood feeding pattern of the mosquitoes. And also warmer temperature can increase the risk of transmission. Warmer temperature can increase the density of infectious mosquitoes in the environment because the time of the incubation of the virus inside the mosquitoes. So more mosquitoes can survive the incubation time, and this can increase the density of infectious mosquitoes in the environment. So more mosquitoes can transmit the virus.
It is a bit of a hump in the sense that there's a sweet spot for climate, for temperature, for humidity, for rainfall. And if you're on either side of that hump, you're less likely to get transmission typically for the vast majority of viruses that are mosquito-borne. I think the general takeaway is that there is this sweet spot.
Hopefully by now you're getting a sense of how complex and interwoven the situation really is, and how, unfortunately, human activity of various kinds is greatly increasing the risk of outbreaks. We'll be back shortly with Doctors Amy Vider and Anise Saloom. You're listening to Eye on Yellow Fever from the Global Coalition of Partners working together to end yellow fever epidemics by 2026. There are 12 episodes ahead of this one in your podcast player. Please go ahead and give them a listen. Share them with friends or colleagues you think would be interested in learning more about yellow fever or have an interest in infectious diseases. You can also subscribe to the podcast so new episodes are always automatically downloaded to your device. To start the second half of this episode, we're zooming in much more closely on our main focus in Eye on Yellow Fever. Dr. Vider, can you talk to us a little bit about how deforestation specifically affects the spread of yellow fever?
We both wrote about this together.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, it seems like when you have forest fragmentation that results from deforestation, you have concentration of particular animals. So, for example, New World monkeys are very susceptible to yellow fever, and these do get concentrated on fragmented little bits of forest. Now, as they get fragmented, they may run out of resources. And if they run out of resources, they have two choices. One is to become extinct or die, essentially, or the other is for them to then scavenge and roam beyond their normal habitat, coming, therefore, into closer contact with humans.
Also, it's very important to know that the mosquitoes that are yellow fever mosquitoes belong to some groups of mosquitoes that Haemococcus, Sabites, and some Aedes species. In the Amazon forest, the most important group is Haemococcus and Sabites, and also involves some non-human primates that belong to three different genus. That's Aloata. Aloata is a monkey that when they are infected, they die very fast. So they tell us when we see monkeys, Aloata monkeys dead in the forest, means that we have circulation of yellow fever virus. But there are other monkeys that are not so sensitive to yellow fever, so they can survive longer. And they are important to spread the virus. And it's not very clear, but it's also possible that some other mammals can also be involved in the transmission of the virus as reservoir. So they can keep the virus circulate and they don't die. That's important because this is a way to keep the virus circulating in the forest. And also there is a transmission in the mosquitoes from mother to the babies, to the eggs, and from the eggs to the larvae and pupa and to new adults, to the adults that emerge from those larvae. And this is another way to keep the virus circulating in period between the epidemics. When the forest is fragmented, so the niche for the animals, like monkeys, they shrink the niche. They normally live in the forest canopy, but when they have a shortage of food, they can go to the ground to harvest for food, and they also can go to the forest edge to harvest for food. And sometimes when the house is close to the forest, they can go not to the house, but to the crops people grow around the house to harvest for food. And so in doing this, they have contact with other species that are not sylvatic species, but are more anthropophilic species that depends on the edge of the forest to survive for the habitats and also for blood feeding. So start transmission, not sylvatic, but in the interface between rural and forest environment.
Not only does forest fragmentation force the wildlife out from the canopy to look for food, it also forces the communities of people to spend more time inside and often deeper inside the forest. They too are looking for food.
And normally these poor communities and vulnerable communities, they live in very precarious houses. Because they are very poor, they depend on forest animals as source of protein. So they have to go to the forest to hunt for animals. But deforestation and forest fragmentation is decreasing the availability of animals for them as source of proteins. And this forces the populations to encroach deeper and stay longer inside the forest. And this propitiates the longer contact with the sylvatic cycle of the yellow fever, because they stay there sometimes several days. Also, they don't have access for health care. They have some access, but not good access for health care. For example, if they get yellow fever, they will get fever. But fever in the forests can be malaria, can be Mayaro, can be Oropush, can be several arboviruses. So in the first day, they don't know what if they have yellow fever or not. They will know in the second phase of the yellow fever when they are very, very, very sick. And then they don't have a hospital for support treatment because it's too far. Sometimes they take days to reach a hospital because they have to travel by boat.
The communities that I'm most familiar with are, for example, in the Peruvian Amazon, and there they range anywhere from urban dwellers who have access to clinics all the way to maybe a single family that's living by themselves in the middle of the forest with no access to pretty much anything. You can imagine that the more remote, the more distant the community slash families, the less access they're going to have to vaccination. And that's key, of course, to eliminating yellow fever. And they're not getting any vaccines, by the way, by far and large. So access to healthcare is the huge barrier here, I would say. But also vector control strategies rarely, if ever, reach out to those far outposts. And I'm talking like getting in a boat and going upstream for a day or two, not even that far. And you're going to find communities that are rarely ever contacted.
So, given all of the things that we've talked about, the higher temperatures, more extreme weather, growing populations, what do you both expect to see the future of yellow fever in this region? What should we be planning for right now?
There have been modeling efforts to predict, but if you think about all the various variables that are at play and how little we really know about what's going on the ground, any given point in time, I think it makes it almost a fool's errand to try to predict. But that said, in Brazil, for example, the enzootic cycle or the forest cycle occurs every 6, 7 to maybe 9 years, very predictably, actually. Where is not predictable, so it wanders from place to place. Probably that's a reflection of the local primate population and their age structure and how recently they were impacted by yellow fever. So if it's been long enough for naive young primates that have come about, but now we're susceptible, then that might be a prime area. But we don't have the data to really know where, you know. Now, that said, this past 2016, 2018 outbreak that Dr. Salum is much more familiar with, being there on site, what was really notable was that there was an expansion outside of the Amazon basin into the city and urban areas, and that was very scary. And that was, I think, not predicted. But now that that has happened, we should definitely prepare and look out for that in the coming cycle. Now, speaking of, that was 2016. We're in 2022 now. So I think it might be a very good time for us to ready ourselves.
My final question for you guys both is, what mitigation measures do you think can be put in place for these impacts? In both of your opinions, what can we do to help mitigate future outbreaks? Because like you said, Dr. Viter, it sounds like we are about to hit that 6 to 9 year cycle. So we really need to be prepared. And what can we do to help prevent the next big outbreak?
If you think about sylvatic cycle of yellow fever and other zoonotic arboviruses, I think that we have to think about deforestation and how to mitigate the impact of deforestation, and also how to stop deforestation, because the agricultural production in the Amazon is not very high, it's unsustainable. So a strong policy for forest protection is absolutely important. And also the adoption of some standard to guarantee the import origin of that crop. They have to have some kind of stamp saying that this comes from deforestation and this does not come from deforestation. This is important because people that are buying, it's not just soybean, it's soybean generated from the devastation of the Amazon forest. And also the collaboration between industry and research and government, and also non-government organization, to identify and realize a solution to provide a sustainable livelihood. And for the indigenous people, land are precious and they depend on them to survive. So they need the forest intact to have access for food and for living.
Dr. Viter, do you have some additional thoughts to add on just how can we mitigate risk moving forward?
Yeah, it lies on a spectrum, distal factors all the way up to the proximate.
Distal, meaning further away from or more global in scale, and proximate, meaning closer in or more local.
So, for example, Dr. Salim addressed the distal ones just now, the major forces that are behind deforestation in the first place, and they absolutely need to be addressed. Then along those distal lines, I think we're also very much in agreement about the role of poverty, social inequality, and injustice that really lead to people having to move into new areas to forge and eke out a living in a pretty hostile kind of environment for most. So really addressing that underlying poverty and social inequality serves not just to prevent yellow fever, but really, of course, it would address so many social and public health ills. Now, naturally, that's not easily actionable. So on the more proximate end, you have people who are already there. They're quite vulnerable, a lot of folks, and we're most certainly not talking about victimizing them and trying to drive them out of their lands, for example. Traditional or indigenous people and tribes have certainly been the best stewards of forests, and we would strongly advocate for giving them more voice, giving them more rights over their own land, over their own destinies. Definitely. And then similar token, the riverine populations have been there for a long time as well. And the subsistence farmer, they're already struggling so much. So to support them from a public health standpoint, but also an agricultural technical standpoint. Here at University of Florida, we have, for example, agricultural extension programs that go into communities and really help farmers. And I think that such things do exist, but maybe they could be fortified throughout the Amazon basin to maximize and perhaps institute more of the indigenous practices too that end up yielding better results over time and allow people to farm on ultimately smaller amounts of land. But we also talked about the vaccination earlier, and so that would be the most proximate solution here, to really get that reach out to folks who are at most risk, probably those who are indeed out in the forests, who are in their plot of land that's right adjacent to the forest. Reaching those people and providing them with the kind of public health support that they need is critical in this whole discussion.
Dr. Amy Veeder, Assistant Professor in Infectious Diseases and Global Medicine at the University of Florida, and also Dr. Anise Saloom, Medical Epidemiology and Entomology Professor at Sao Paulo University's School of Public Health. Thanks very much to both of them for speaking with us. An important reminder before we leave you that word of mouth is so important when it comes to reaching new audiences with podcasts. So if you have colleagues or friends who you think would find this episode useful or interesting, please let them know about us by sending them a link. You can subscribe or follow to make sure that all future episodes of Eye on Yellow Fever are automatically downloaded direct to your device. Thank you for being with us. This episode was produced by Dave Howard with research from Amelia Jansen and sound design by Adam Whaley. I'm Maggie Silver. Eye on Yellow Fever is a Bango Media production for the Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemics strategy.